This is Growth Guide, a podcast exploring the depths of curiosity, questioning everything in the name of growth. I'm your host, Brian D'Alessandro. Those of you who know me know I love nature and systems thinking. That's why I resonate so deeply with the permaculture approach to gardening and farming. My guest today is Morag Gamble, an incredible permaculture ecologist and educator. If we go by the metric of goosebumps per episode, this one is leading the pack. Hearing Morag discuss the principles of nature, relationships, and our greater global systemic disharmony has left me with some great practical tips and applications, as well as just feeling hopeful and inspired. I'm pretty confident it's going to do the same for you. Morag is the founder of the Permaculture Education Institute with students on 6 continents. She's also the executive director of the Ethos Foundation, which is a small permaculture charity dedicated to supporting women and youth in gaining access to permaculture education and becoming leaders and teachers in their own communities. The Ethos Foundation supports refugees, indigenous youth, and people in the global south. Get ready for a healthy dose of connection. Morag, thank you so much for joining today on the podcast. I'm really excited that we were able to make this work, being we're on opposite hemispheres. So thank you.
Hi, and thank you for having me on this show. It's really lovely to be here with you.
And you're obviously going through some pretty wild times there that fit into your area of permaculture. Can you talk a little bit about what's happening down in Australia right now?
Yeah, we're in the midst of a massive flood here, and I was a little bit worried that, again, it might not work today because the skies opened up again and we're locked back in. We're in some parts of the areas around me, the bioregion just to the south of me, is in what they're calling a 1 in 500 year flood, which is something essentially we haven't seen before since Australia has been settled by white people. So, of course, the indigenous people of these lands would have seen it before, but we haven't. And it's huge. It's spread so far. We haven't really even got a sense of what the damage is so far. But it's unfolding as we speak. It's still spreading out across the land, which is it's challenging for these communities that it's hitting, because these are the same kind of communities, not all of them, but many of them were hit by the bushfires which ravaged Australia not that long ago. So what we're seeing are these massive extremes, and it is being attributed to climate change, the extremes that we've never seen before, the more frequent occurrence of them, both as a massive flood or as a massive drought or bushfires. So it's climate change, but it's also the way that the land is being managed, or the way that it's being not managed, I should say, in terms of it being overcleared and the catchments not being managed in terms of the bioregional approach. And so, yeah, it's a really difficult time here at the moment. Just yesterday, I was helping my mother-in-law clean out underneath her house. Her bottom floor was completely flooded, and I walked down her street and there's just people in tears. All their life stuff is just on the street, covered in mud, and the place stinks. It absolutely stinks.
What is the smell from? Is it sewage or?
Just mud, cleaning out all the pipes under the city, because what happens, it backs up and then it just spurts back out into where the suburbs are, and it just and then it sits and just seeps. And so the whole place is just sodden and stinky, and everything that they have that's in that flood zone, it would have been up to my chin all the way across her particular street. And it's heartbreaking. Yeah.
Absolutely heartbreaking and devastating. And at the same time, when I zoom out and think about this, right, you spoke about the wildfires, and then we have the extreme flooding, and they seem to bookend this viral pandemic that we've been experiencing. All of these are expressions of purging, right? A natural purging that's taking place in different ways. And I can't help but feel on some level that Mother Earth is trying to purge things and recalibrate. What are your thoughts there?
Well, I get a little bit worried when we sort of think about the notion of purging as an intent in that way.
Well, I don't mean purging as in like trying to get rid of humans or anything, but even like as you spoke about, the pipes getting flushed out, more of a flushing out than, anything else.
Well, it's kind of, there's this, I'm not sure if you've come across this theory of deep ecology and Gaia theory. And it's really, the science behind that is talks about how the earth acts as a living system, and that it's constantly, there's no stable state. So when we're talking about we want to live sustainably, it's not about being in a stable state. It's about everything in flux. And the flux is within a range which is suitable for life to continue and to flourish. And so
Right.
therefore we have this state where this fluctuation is getting more extreme. The Earth's systems, in order to bring it back into a stable state, end up going into more extremes. And so therefore we are getting to this point where where it is becoming harder for life to thrive in that comfortable bubble that we've been dwelling in. And that's just a short period of time. And I think what we're seeing is the humanity's ability to impact that natural flow and that natural state. And that's where we are at the moment. We're kind of bumping up against the edge of what is sustainable. And so we need to get into this state of being restorative. We need to start to regenerate the system so that we can bring back, Earth's systems back into something that can support the flourishing of life that we know.
So I have like full body chills, and you could probably see the whole time you're speaking about this. It sounds exactly like the same systemic issues we're suffering in our human bodies, our systems of its desire to come back to homeostasis, which isn't a perfect still point, but it's a point where the systems and the circulations are in their steady flowing state that's helpful for recovery, growth, reproduction, all of these natural systems. And the earth is, I think as above, so below, it all fractals. And the same way we could look at our human bodies and say, man, in just the last 100 years, we have done so much to destroy our body's ability to maintain or return to homeostasis in a healthy way. I mean, we have chronic stress, chronic inflammation. We're using all types of pharmaceuticals, throwing our, glandular system out of whack. I mean, all of these different elements that are just clearly giving us a sign like we're not living in harmony with nature's intent and design. And it just echoes so clearly for me what's happening in nature as well.
And I think this raises a really interesting point around, when you take that systemic approach and you start to ask the question about health and well-being. A guy often asks it in the context of like, well, where is health? Like, is health in the education system? Is health in the economic system? Is health in the medical profession? Is health in our agricultural system? Where is health? Health is in all of it. Health is in the stability of the ecosystems within our forests. It exists everywhere. And so we do need to take this systemic approach and always add an extra context. And thinking about, if we think we can just address our health issues by taking kind of just a few dimensions of it, we miss the bigger context. And so this, I think, is why I've decided to focus on permaculture, because it is something that is so super tangible that enables people anywhere to be able to start to not only create healthy living environments and habitats, but it also helps to regenerate and restore the planetary systems. And so it's kind of that is that earth care, people care, and then thinking about not just what's for me, but for other species, people on the other side of the planet. It has that broader sense. And so that's why I end up landing, coming from a systems perspective, like, well, how can we apply this? How can we make sense of this, where we are in our communities, and then work from that bioregional level, the local level, back out again. So it's big picture activism. We're constantly thinking about what's going on globally, but bring it into something. I used to see that as a struggle, like, well, you're either working on big picture activism or you're working at the local level. I think it's not an either or, it's an and. When you are doing something that is so beautifully cohesive in your local environment, and it's working and it's buzzing and people are loving it and you're making changes, the stories that ripple out from that, like there's this myceliation that just, it's like placing compost on a place, and then it just, it's kind of like these acupuncture points of life that, and so you can work locally. And now, because we have such a connected globe, we can really be focusing on, local and bioregional, but at the same time be communicating that out as a global action.
I love it. And I mean, look, most of the metaphors I use are from nature as it is. So, I mean, there are going to be a lot of them today, but right, the mycelial network, what we're doing is bringing these deeper issues and deeper truths to the surface. And so we're making them accessible. And this whole idea that just like in nature, what's happening on the surface is intrinsically intertwined and related to what's happening underneath. So it makes perfect sense that the macro and micro are happening in tandem and actually expressions of the exact same thing, just in different ways. And that also brings me, I just want to go back to what you said about, well, where does health live, right? Is it here or there? And, for me, the clearest way of seeing it is health is not in the what, it's in the how. And we need to look at health of everything and every system. But the beautiful thing about every system is when you start seeing it in one, you not only understand it to apply to another, but I experience it as a remembering. When you get
Mm.
out there in the garden, I mean, look at all of the positive impact and amazing results that we see from gardening, rooftop gardens in prisons, right? Especially in the US, where it's such a disservice in how the prison systems are set up. Yet just reconnecting human beings back to that natural cycle of life and that experience of being alive, there's a remembering that happens. And the way we start applying that in our life is impossible to ignore.
Mm. And I also, it's this question too around where is change? How does change happen? And it's like you can't make change happen. You can create the context in which change can take place when there's a deeper relationship and connectedness that happens, and a remembering and a lifing and a deepening. And so you said it's not about a what, it's not about the elements that you collect. It is about how, which is the process. But I would like to add into that too. It's the relationship. It's the betweenness. It's what's going on in between those processes. It's the processes of the processes. And the more that we can cultivate these relationships, and that is what the mycelial network teaches us too, isn't it? It's not just about the tree or the tree and its roots and its process with the sun. It's about how that tree relates to that tree, and it relates to all the other species that are in there. And we're thinking, I think the garden is a great place to explore life in a very non-confrontational way. Like we could talk about really big concepts in the garden. And one of the things that I really like to talk about, and it's not a confrontational thing, but it's essentially that thing that a garden is a community. And it's a community of all life. It's not just, when you go out and you're trying to create a vegetable garden, for example, it's not just about the vegetables that you plant and then you just kind of got to bring everything in. It's only when you create the conditions when everything can thrive, the things that you don't see, the soil life, when you invite in many different diversity of species. It's not just the one type. When you have the habitat for the birds and the butterflies and the bees and the frogs and the lizards, and we have so much going on there that it becomes a stable state that doesn't require a whole lot of energy to maintain and keep in a stable state, and that is so vulnerable. And I'm just looking around at the vulnerability that we're in right now, and it doesn't matter whether it's a flood or a fire or COVID or whatever, the shelves just keep getting empty in the stores. I walked into a store the other day just to have a look what was going on. No fresh food anywhere, completely devoid. You could get a whole lot of canned stuff, but nothing fresh. And so the vulnerability of our food system has just become evident again. We have 3 days and we can't get fresh food.
And we've seen through the pandemic some of our of them are emotional responses and fear responses. Some of them are logistics and, the weather impacting growing and transportation and everything else. So it's very real. And the part you're talking about with a garden doesn't really work or thrive until you have all of these different parts. It goes right back to what you said about relationship, right? It's not even a matter of the collection of individual parts in the system. It is the relationships that they hold. And we've been talking about mycelium, right? I mean, when I first learned, listening to Paul Stamets speak around the exchange and the governance that the mycelial network is in charge of, is really, and they're not the only ones, but just their role of distributing resources, not just across the mycelium, but to the trees, to flowers, to the soil. I mean, it's just absolutely awe-inspiring, like to see the intelligence that exists there. And that's why I do believe when we work with a garden, we tap into an intelligence that really lends itself to solving a lot of the human issues, because our problem solving is strictly done in the intellectual space. And because of that, we devalue the intelligence we see that isn't intellectual. But nature is so chock full of wisdom that we can't even begin to comprehend.
No, I think there's a sort of arrogance that we come in with when we think that we can control and manage it as much as we do. I've come to really understand over, decades of being in the garden, that it works the best when I'm perceiving myself as one of the many species that are existing in the garden, and that I am the garden gardening. I'm not the gardener. I'm not doing it to it. I'm doing it with it. And it's this completely different relationship.
Oh, you did it again. Wow. I got full body chills. That is so good. Yeah, I remember when I first heard the idea that we don't live on planet Earth, but we're of planet Earth. And that does it so beautifully. Wow. You're the garden gardening itself.
And what I notice when I do step into that space is that it becomes a peaceful way of gardening. There is a sense of ease, and I'm not in competition. I'm not struggling, fighting another species that may be interfering with what my intent is. That there becomes a balance and an ease. And what I notice in what's going on in the garden can then shift and change the way that I am in relationship in community or in family. And it becomes more about lifing as opposed to being like these separate beings that are trying to kind of push our way through places or to push change. And it can also then inform, how I approach. I grew up as an activist. I started when I was about 14 campaigning against nuclear war. That was kind of the time in the early 1990s or whenever that was. I was a forest campaigner. I kind of got tired of the fight. I totally have not given up on terms of speaking up about any of those things, but I think I've shifted and changed the way in which I'm being in that space. And like, how does change happen? I remember as a young teenager, I'd be walking along, and I remember this is one moment. I remember when I saw friends of mine coming along, and they were sort of a bit further up, and they kind of crossed the street and went down another road. And I thought, and it was because I kept on trying to tell them abouting. I was abouting all the time. I was saying, we've got to change. We shouldn't be doing this. And I think people just got too tired of it. And it was a wake-up call. And I'm so glad they did that to me.
Yeah, what a gift.
Really, yeah, I know. From that time onwards, I started to think, well, what is the kind of change, and what is my role in that? I have this deep fire in my belly all the time about needing to be fully present in what's going on. I just simply can't step away from it and ignore it. Otherwise it hurts. This fire starts to burn in a way that hurts. But when I'm stepping into this space of being fully present and engaged, I feel it kind of, this sounds a bit woo-woo, I know I'm not really trying to be woo-woo, but it feels like I feel it coming out of my fingers, like it's an energy that goes forth. It's just, I know when I'm in the space, when I'm actually being as I feel like I don't even know how to describe. I don't have words for this. This is not a wordy kind of thing that I'm trying to describe. It's a feeling. I don't have words.
Well, can I ask you, when you feel that fire burning, where is that you feel it in your body?
I feel it right in my belly,
Mm-hmm.
right. Well, I can't show you. It's down,
Yeah.
right high up in my belly. But I also feel it pulsing through. Like I feel it in my hands as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's this intensity.
And when you feel was it hurt or sadness?
Yeah.
Where do you feel that when it comes on?
Well, again, it's like it's an internal, like right in my gut. It's like it starts to hurt, and I end up I find myself crumpling over. This has been my whole life. I can quite easily see it, and I remember my mum even noticing it, and she would point it out to me, and it was just something that is so it's so visceral for me. I can't ignore it. If I ignore it, I get sick.
And if we shine it back onto systems, right? Like your whole system, like you have this all going on around the gut. I like to look back to like the Vedic philosophy of the three brains in the body: the mind, the heart, and the stomach. And the stomach really being this digestive area, which is very much the soil, right? It is the area for breaking down, composting, and renewing, and letting go of what doesn't serve. So there's a really interesting metaphor that's living in there.
And I think the digestion one is a really good one. If we think about earth systems and the digestive process of the earth, I think often we see what's above. We see the trees or the animals or that, but what's below the soil is where most of that which creates the support system for all life happens in that digestive process.
Again, it's so interesting, right? Because it's intrinsically, what's happening below is intrinsically connected to what's happening on the surface, the beautiful trees and flowers, with all of the death and decay and everything happening below. And so in some ways, it's like when we're taking on the fight, we're slinging shit at them basically, and we're wondering why they're crossing the street ultimately, right? And so the idea of, well, how can we present them with the flowers that can help them to connect with that and maybe make that decision themselves to engage a different way? Because what it comes back to for me, and I've been in that same loop for a lot of my life, is something angers me and I'll get adversarial about it, right? Or there's a confrontational aspect to it. And what happens is we either find other people that are willing to fight and we both fight, and then there's a winner and a loser, or we go to fight with someone and someone says, nope, I'm out of here, and they get out of there. But rarely are we having the conversations with people where there's a possibility for changing in our beliefs, our positions, and an ability to even merge them.
Yeah. I work a lot with an amazing woman called Nora Bateson, whose father is Gregory Bateson. She's carrying on his work. He's amazing systems thinker, probably one of the most incredible systems thinkers, ecological thinkers of our time. Anyway, she talks a lot about this idea that a change in perception is where the change happens. It kind of really struck when I first started working with her. I was thinking, like often we sort of feel like the need to do something, like the change or action is only when we doing something. Whereas she's saying, well, action action that needs to happen first is actually this shift in perception, because until we start to change how we see ourselves in relation to others, see ourselves in relation to the planet systems, it's the perception. And how do you change perception? You add new context, you add new ideas, you add new flavors, and that only comes through conversation. It's exactly what you said. And so how do you bring about change in the world? You need to create more space to having really good conversations, and not necessarily always where people are agreeing with each other. We need different ideas coming through, not in that confrontational way. We don't want to do that kind of, and it's about creating spaces where these conversations can happen. And so this has become a really big form of the kind of activism that I do now, which is creating spaces for conversations and the sharing of ideas and the opening up. So we can toss it, and it's like I was trying to describe about the energy thing. I don't have words for it. A lot of the things that we need to talk about, we don't have words. We need to get in the practice of communicating these things. We're not used to articulating it. And so we need to create these spaces where we can we hear someone else's, and then we bring that in, rather than just sort of parroting what we hear on the news or wherever, but actually exploring and shifting our perceptions. Because when we get a shift in perception, then it just naturally flows that how we then act in our work, in our home, in our community, in our garden, in wherever, the choices and decisions that we make are shifting because we've had a shift in perception. So it is the most profound and most powerful form of activism and action that we can be taking.
It's really interesting hearing you talk about that. And at its most ideal state, it almost feels like maybe that's really the only action we need to take, because if we truly take that action and that change takes place. And did you have such an experience that led you to becoming the gardening itself?
I can't think of any particular experience, like one-off. It's like some things are like it's this light bulb moment, bang, and it's there. Other times it takes time to get things into your elbows and into your knees. It's a practice. And often we want to have this change now. We want to go and study something, learn something, but we might do that, but then it takes years for it to kind of, the more you do it, the new realizations that you have, and the more that you're like we can have conversations with other humans. We can have conversations with other mammals. We can have conversations with the gardens. And again, this sounds like really weird, and I'm not trying to be, but, say, for example, I live in this eco-village. This eco-village has been here for 30 years. And I've watched as the transformation of this degraded landscape has become regenerated. And we now have amazing wildlife that comes in here. And there's a family of kangaroos that lives in and around my home. And I've seen generations of these kangaroos grow up here. And so we know each other. We know each other so well. Like, they're not our pets. We don't feed them, but we coexist. We live in this space, and we have a conversation every day. I remember one time when my son was just a baby, and I had him in a sling, and I'd just come, he was just so new. Anyway, I walked outside, and there was this wallaby, and all of a sudden she just kind of like opened up her pouch and showed me her new baby. And I was just like, oh, and he's mine. And we were just comparing, it was the most amazing experience. And then there's another time, there's something about owls for me that are incredible. And I find that when I'm in a calm state and I'm walking at night, there's always an owl. And sometimes when I am completely not focusing and I'm feeling off balance, I have a not very pleasant interaction with an owl. And one day I was driving along and my mind was all over. I was so upset about climate change. I was focusing on all the bad news, and filling up my brain with the bad news. And I was driving along, and all of a sudden I felt this dunk, and I looked back and there's this owl. I'd hit an owl. I couldn't believe I'd hit an owl. And I stopped the car and I got out, and the owl just kind of disappeared. And I thought, oh my gosh, it's just going to go off into the grass and die. And I was distraught. I couldn't find it. And anyway, so I hopped back in the car and I went back home, really upset. And as I came back, I came into the carport. This owl flew in and just kind of like flicked the car and then flew off again. And I was so relieved that the owl was okay, but it had kind of come and told me that it was the wrong thing. And another time I was driving home again, and this owl actually flew. I was in this really nice state at that time, and I was driving along. I was driving slowly. I was thinking about things. The window was open. This owl flew in the window, landed on my lap, clipped my cheek. I still feel it. I clipped my cheek with his wing, and just turned and flew off again. And I'm I still remember that so vividly today. There's this thing about owls, and I talk a lot with Indigenous elders here and about totems and anyway, so you start to pay attention to this, and then there's other things, just like reading the landscape. I noticed that there's at a certain time of the year when these particular birds come to my mulberry tree and start calling out for mate, and I know that the rainy season is 2 weeks off. I just have that, that's a reading, but that's an intellectual thing. Then there's these other things that happen in the garden, just that noticing thing or the feeling thing. And I always garden now with bare feet, because instead of using, measuring to feel what the pH is or the moisture or the temperature is, my feet tell me. My feet are my instruments of connectivity, or my hands. So it's always just hands in or feet in. And I think it's just the more in being in the place and grounding and watching and taking the time to notice and see the changes over seasons, over years. And it's almost some of the Indigenous women that I've been talking about it saying, well, that is actually what it takes to be Indigenous in a land. What you're doing is you're becoming Indigenous. Like, you can't be Indigenous because you're not of this land, but you're becoming more like an Indigenous person in this land. And that is the kind of relationship that we want people here to have. And so the kind of permaculture approach that you're doing is something that we really encourage you to support people to explore. And I find that so encouraging, because there is a lot of, I know there's a lot of guilt, there's a lot of shame, there's a lot of all of these feelings around being part of the colonizing people of a land, and part of this healing and coming back together again and being able to connect deeply and to be able to, become the gardening, notice those type of things through being in place and connecting deeply, is a shift that I think is important. But it takes time. It's not an instantaneous thing. It's not a quick fix. It's a journey. It's a lifelong learning process. And I still feel like I'm an absolute beginner. And and I think too, the more that you try and share and invite people to play in this way, invite them to share in the absolute joy and amazingness of every single little thing that surrounds you. You don't have to be in an eco village or a rural area. You can find it anywhere.
Yeah, like you said earlier, it's a practice. It's cultivating this practice, and back to the system. It needs to integrate into the whole system before it can truly be second nature, right? That adopted state. And I love that idea of being Indigenous, and even, becoming Indigenous, like that notion that you took your shoes off and you're gardening with your bare feet. Like, it sounds so obvious when you say it, right? Then the interesting thing is, somewhere in our cultural narrative, to some people, it'll sound like crazy or like even gross, right? Like dirty. And that's like, it's really fascinating to look at that. And it's like, well, this is exactly how we were designed to exist, right? We are a part of this planet. And so to be in deep, again, relationship with it is the truth of it. And that's what I feel is so much of what we're living and experiencing. It's not our deepest truth. And so back to rewriting that story, there's a lot of cultural narratives that we hold, even the ideas of shame, blame, guilt, ridicule or punishment. These are all things that we've come to accept as the right course of action for something that is done wrong. And it's perpetuating more of the same. And so that's doing that route, it's impossible for us to actually have that healing. And so by rewriting this new story and inviting people into it, I think that's the greatest service that you could be doing to heal.
And the invitation, that is the flip side of the repulsion that the previous way of doing it was creating,
Mm.
by repelling people, by confronting people, by being, righteous, like I'm right, you're wrong kind of thing. It's about this idea that, like, I'm a learner. I'm learning how to be in this landscape. I'm exploring, and I'm inviting you to come and explore this with me. And I'm really happy to share with you what I'm learning. And I'd love to learn, what you bring into this as well, because, what I've been involved in a lot of different sorts of community garden projects and projects in different parts of the world. And the some of the most amazing learning happens when you're in a garden, you got your hands in the soil and the stories are being shared. I've learned so much more in that state than I have ever from trying to research it. Like it's that multiple, it's all things. And I'm not trying to say it's only one or it's the other, but not to undervalue or undermine the value of indigenous wisdom, which is an oral history, which is the knowledge shared. And as I've been learning about plants and the way to create, thriving ecological systems that are also food systems, so much of that knowledge has come through conversations with people who are also playing and trying. And I've often want to, I thought, I'd like to write this down and I don't quite know where to start because it's got so many dimensions to it. And it's one of the things that I would love to be sharing more about is, for example, all these incredibly robust foods that are available. When we think about foods, we often think about just one part of a plant or a certain collection of plants, which we have become familiar because that's what's in the shops. There's like 30,000 different varieties of foods available. If we start to really embrace that, we can significantly reduce space that we need to feed ourselves, the impact that we're having, the resilience of the food systems, the hardiness, all of those things. I'm just imagining, say, if my garden's been in flood, but yet I have consciously designed this garden, for example, this food system, so that there's things that are robust in the wet, they're in the dry. If it got burnt, there'd still be things underground. There's a huge amount of diversity in there, and how can we start to understand what that is? And then thinking about food waste, for example, so much of the food that's grown in the world is wasted. Yet, one of the examples that I use a lot of is pumpkin. Like pumpkin. When I say the word pumpkin, you often think of it's just the pumpkin orange bit, but yet every single part of the pumpkin and its vine is edible. So my spinach is pumpkin leaves, and you can eat pumpkin tips and pumpkin, the shoots and the flowers, and you can scoop out the seeds and you toast them, and that's a really great protein. And so, but if you go to a pumpkin farm, all you're going to get is the pumpkin. But what happens to the rest? Often it's kind of poisoned to get rid of it, so it's easy to harvest. And so I would say, we have these figures like 40% of the food that's grown in the world is wasted. I would hazard to say that, 90% of the edible food that's grown in the world is wasted because we actually only eat, the one part, like the broccoli. We eat the broccoli top, yet all the plant of the broccoli is edible. Same with cauliflowers and peas. We get a bag of peas, but yet every single part of the pea plant is edible. And if you think about that shift, if we can relocalize our food system and bring it more into these localized, robust contexts, then our footprint on the planet is so, we know that we need to be regenerating at least half of the planet. How do we do that? And again, this is why I've ended up focusing on food, because unless you're a breatharian, you need to eat and you need to address the food. And it's something we can all do. And it's something that's not a particularly confrontational thing to talk about either. Food is just, and we can come at it from any different perspective. From the health perspective, we can come at it from the forest perspective, we can come at it from education, how we engage our children in these spaces, and from healing, like we've talked about, from reconnecting, from so many different ways.
And in a lot of way, out of necessity. I mean, if this pandemic has shown us anything, is just how volatile our food systems can be. And without having the resilience built into our local communities to be able to accommodate our needs, we're in a very weak and exposed position. And so, I mean, look, I'm further upstate New York out of the city, but I know that immediately everyone that I was speaking to in my community was thinking about, okay, how can we build more resiliency into our own personal garden with each other as a community? And this whole notion of breaking through that myopic idea of what is the food versus what is actually edible and useful that can be applied in such a versatile way, that really opens up in a big way when there's a necessity for it. And look, if things are going the way that they've been showing us, we're going to have a lot more of these challenges we have to solve for. So why not get ahead of it, right?
And, just chatting with some people over in Europe last week, they were talking about how worried they are because of, so much of their fossil fuels coming across from Russia, and that now all changing, that it's incredibly, like, most of the food they're saying is grown in greenhouses that requires gas to heat them. So where is the food going to come from? So starting to think differently about our energy systems, our food systems. It's not just a nice thing to think about. I think it's an essential thing to be thinking about and to be paying far more attention to, not just in local communities, but far beyond that as well.
In regards to that, we have trends that are constantly coming about in this world. I know, the word regenerative or regeneration has been said a few times here, but it's being spoken about and now applied to all different industries. Can you talk about the importance of regenerative agriculture, as I know it pertains to permaculture, but also how we can possibly apply that elsewhere?
Mm. Well, what I'm seeing happening at a smaller scale permaculture garden system is being applied also in regenerative farms. The whole process of the principles of diversification, the principles of no dig, and focusing on regenerating the soil so that the soil can come alive. And I think the underpinning part of that is recognizing that the earth is a living system, and within that are living systems, so that you have the soil living system. We can't treat soil as dirt. And so regenerative farming, is the aim of that is to bring the soil to life and to create the context in which that life can continue to thrive. So that means restoring the water systems, restoring, the forests. So it takes that bigger picture, and look, and then how you can apply that. And, we certainly have a very long way to go until it's a common thing. I think sometimes that I'm overly confident because I live in a bubble of always talking to people who are talking about regenerative things. And when I peek out, sometimes, try and always see what's going on in the world, I do get rather shocked. But I feel like it's in this process of change, it's not like you need to change everything. There needs to be enough of things that are working, that are in a different way, from a different paradigm, that when something happens, they are robust. They're kind of like beacons. Or if you're taking the mycelial metaphor again, they're kind of like the mushrooms that pop up. The mycelial network connects, and then there's these little mushrooms that pop up all over the place, and they're seen. and they invite people to come and have a look. And so I think this is what's happening in the regenerative movement. We're seeing it in urban areas, in rural areas. We're seeing it in, ranches. We're seeing it at every single scale. And this mycelial network connects it. So I feel like the change is actually much bigger than what it looks like necessarily. And I have to keep reminding myself that. And it's also about how I feel about the process of change in lots of different things, that the real power is what's going on in that interconnections, that every single place that I go around the world, or every single place where I talk to now, people are familiar with this. It's not an unknown thing anymore. It's not some fringe type of activity, or a weird way of doing things. It is fully accepted and known and understood to be possibly the best way. What we're trying to work out is, how do we shift from where we are now to where that is? And I think some of the crises that are happening now are actually accelerating the shift, because we're not having to make the decision to make the shift. The decision is kind of being made for us in many ways, which is hard to swallow, but it's kind of a reality too.
And I hope that it proves to be a systemic change, right? And not a trend or a fad, because this really gets to the core of so much of our issues. And with such a simple concept being adopted, man, you start seeing how it's applied. I mean, I'm seeing it applied to communication design, to architecture, to finance, and everything in between. And so it anytime that happens, it shows you what a beautiful systemic concept it is. And I'm hopeful that this will be something that starts really permeating into all areas, as it's begun to do. And the thing that seems to happen, like you were saying, is the same way in the garden, you don't need to change everything. When you change a few of those areas that become beacons, it allows for other areas to recognize it and start to adapt in order to work within that new system, one which they identify as being more beneficial for their health. So I'm hopeful.
Yeah, I think there is an incredible reorientation that's happening. And I think there is a paradigm shift, a worldview shift that's happening, and a much deeper recognition of, as you said, like the living system as our guide for lifing, and the language that we're using is changing. And I do think that the awareness around what's going on below our feet, this, the awareness that's been brought to our attention about what's going on with the mycelial networks, for example, I think that has just completely shifted how we see things. I mean, I go into like community talks and we start, chatting about this, and we talk about how, at school, what is a tree? And like a tree or a plant, it's a structure that has roots, that gathers nutrients and water, and it does this exchange with the sun and blah, blah, blah. But that's not it, is it? I mean, that's just kind of one little piece of this web of relationships, and that you can't actually describe the tree without describing the context, or the context that it has with the soil life and the mycelial network, and understanding too that the amount of life in the soil that is mycelial is way more than anything else, just about, and that there are so much more of that than there is of all the animal kingdom or the plant kingdom. And then there's fungi. We're just sort of standing on this precipice of going, we actually realize that we don't know really how life works, and we need to reorient how we see life, and how it connects, and how it moves and shapes us, and how deeply embedded and connected we are with the whole of life. We can't separate ourselves as this other that controls it. We're actually really not that much in control. We can affect it, we can impact it, but we need to bring ourselves back into that form of being in relationship, in partnership with life. And that's where the change begins to happen, when we have that awareness shift. And I feel that there has been, in the last couple of years, a massive shift. And I think possibly because we were on this sort of massive track of we were embedded in, and we just kind of bumped off it. And in that, trying to find the new pathways that we wanted to move along, found different ways of seeing and expressing ourselves, and to understanding who we were and what was important, and what was even the point of work or education or anything really. Like, we have had a space to reflect, and not all the time. I know there's been huge suffering as well, and I'm thinking about particularly what I'm thinking of at the moment is, I work a lot with refugees in East Africa, and the reflective time over there is not particularly high. So, again, when I'm speaking, I also have to be very mindful of, within certain contexts, that is happening. And I also think that the impact that the Western way of life is having on the whole globe, I think the reflective time that we've had here will have an impact across the globe. So I think there's so many different dimensions to explore, and I can't say one statement that is a global statement that kind of misinterprets what I'm trying to say.
No, but I think that's so important, and thank you for bringing into the conversation, acknowledging those who are suffering through a transformative experience like this. I think it's just important to acknowledge. In that same idea, transformation, when we see it in nature, is often accompanied with some devastating effects, even when it's a positive transformation, right? There's always this shuffle that happens, and it doesn't fare the same for everyone. But I do think if we look back to the worldview shift, this idea of being in a unified existence where we are one being and living as individual parts within it, that is really the impetus for this change. And fortunately, that pendulum does swing wide. And so as we have gone down that track, as you've kind of noted to, I'll call it the Newtonian or separatist lens, right? Of just really trying to dissect and control in the spirit of understanding, right? But we've also learned, like, okay, wait, there's a limit to that, and we can get lost in that and forget that we are a part of something much larger, and there are these interrelated, interconnected parts in relationship with each other. And I do believe that this new era that we're going into is the era of the relationships. It's really about honoring, understanding, and deeply immersing ourselves in those relationships. And one area that I've been really taken by more recently through this pandemic is the old myth of self-regulation, that we're designed to go at it alone, to just pull ourselves up by the bootstraps and to, tough it out and deal with it ourselves. And this tells us that we're alone, right? And loneliness, depression, and suffering all come along with that, but also that asking for help or accepting help is a weakness. And that is the greatest disservice we could do to our humanity's psyche. I mean, we process through co-regulation. And without having our community and valuing those relationships in a deep way, we are really entering into a state of dis-ease that is going to build and build and fester, as I believe we have seen. And so we're now at that critical point where it's starting to break, and we have to choose. Are we going to change that narrative and come back to our true nature, which is being relational beings? Or are we going to stay where we were? And we know how that's been working for us. So not to force your hand, but your choice.
And I think you're absolutely right. We are in this space of acknowledging that we are purely relational. Everything about us is like, even me and you. I am a collection of more than a billion living living things. That I am not, often I don't mean to sound disrespectful, but when some people say, "Oh, what are your pronouns?" I will say she, we, like I am a we, all of those living beings that form me. I just happen to have a boundary around me that you can identify as a we, that is me, and that I am in relationship with this plant. There's really no separation between us, like the breath. Through our breath, we are all, there is that sort of singularity that exists. And so it does shift so much how we see. And I think too, like you're saying, that a lot of things that happen have helped us to notice that, and also notice in our neighborhoods. Just the example, when I was in the city yesterday helping with the flood cleanup that's going on and up and down the street, normally people don't really talk to each other. They go in and out of their houses and there's not much relationship going on between them. Everyone was on the street. Everyone was helping each other. There was people from up the street who were coming down and helping the old ladies pull things out, and someone else had their water cut off, so someone knew someone who came over and helped them. And there was a community, and this community was thriving, and they felt better because they felt together. There was something about that, knowing that they had a relationship. And there's scientific studies that talk about how the more isolated you are, your lifespan actually diminishes quite significantly. And the onset of dementia comes more quickly. And so we have scientific evidence that demonstrates.
And at the other end of the life cycle, when a baby is born, there are tons of studies. They could give them all the food that they need, all the warmth and clothing that they need. But if they're denied physical contact, they will die. So there's a lot of science, and it's through all areas of life. And that's one of the really sad downsides to this pandemic, is the social isolation, which has been a result of it. And so I think as people are able to come back together, we've got to double down on it, right? We've got to get back together. We have to be with each other in emotionally and intellectually intimate ways, and really return to it. Yeah, I can't speak enough about how important I feel this is.
And it doesn't have to be complex, complicated stuff. It just simple, inviting some people over for a cup of tea, or organizing a shared meal in the street.
And in the street, smiling at someone, making eye contact, right? I mean, these things get your mirror neurons going again, because I don't think they work as well over Zoom. So, there's a lot in the small.
Yeah, well,
and
because in
large.
Zoom we have this one little box, and it's just, you can get a lot from it. I mean, I have absolutely been so happy to have the opportunity to talk with people by Zoom around the world throughout the pandemic. But you miss the rest. You miss that whole body sense, the senses, the smell even, or that, all of that. It is sort of, missing a huge amount. But I also think that what it's helped us to do is to connect more deeply with the more than human world. Like if you get a chance to kind of slow down and just be in your garden, maybe you've never gardened before, you thought it was just kind of, not something you were interested in. I've had people writing to me saying, this has been the thing that's kept me sane. I never knew that I loved it so much, and this has been incredibly healing, and I'm going to continue it because it makes me feel so good. So our relational thing doesn't necessarily have to be always human. It can be in the more than human world, and I think that's also something really lovely to keep in mind. And that is the perception thing too, that we are never alone necessarily. There's always other beings and other species and others around us, whether they're familiar necessarily with us or not. But yes, simply like what you're saying, a simple smile goes such a long way. I mean, I live in a small town, and it's kind of funny because everyone, and and you're always smiling and waving to people, and you know people's cars, whatever they have, and you wave to a car even if you can't see the person. And so you start going into the town and you're waving and smiling. You've got that kind of like that really openness about you. And it's funny the reactions that you get. And if you spend too much time there, you find it sort of closing down a bit. But I try all the time to keep it as open as I can. And the beautiful conversations that happen and amazing interactions. And yeah, it's a wonderful thing. And it doesn't cost you anything to smile, does it?
No, it doesn't. And the returns are fantastic. Well, Morag, thank you so much for joining today. This has me smiling. It's been a wonderful conversation. I think we touched on some great areas and given some really good tools for how people can connect with that deeper sense of oneness and how to use gardening, farming, wherever you want to apply it to really tap into this wisdom. So thank you, Morag.
Thank you for having me, Brian. It's been a real pleasure. I know I'm smiling more than when I started talking to you.
Thanks for joining us this week on Growth Guide. A big thanks to our sponsors. This episode is sponsored by Morning Man. Live manly, own the morning. I learned about this from UFC champ Frank Shamrock. He was always having trouble getting started in the morning without like 7 or 8 cups of coffee. No exaggeration, I've seen this in person. So he created this product that's packed full of 45 superfoods and it has 95 milligrams of clean caffeine. So you get that charge from the greens and also get a hit from the caffeine without feeling all jacked up. I'm definitely caffeine sensitive and I like this product because it doesn't make me feel like I'm bouncing off the walls, but I feel sharp and energized to get shit done. Visit growthguide.love/morningman to learn more and use promo code GROWTH for 15% off. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Atmananda Yoga. You guys have got to check out their yoga alignment mat. I've been using this for a long time. As you know by now, I've studied and trained with them as a yoga teacher, and the mat is incredible to deepen your practice and to ensure a lifelong injury-free practice. Visit growthguide.love/alignment for more info or to buy. Be sure to use code GROWTH at checkout for 15% off. Make sure to visit our website, growthguide.love, where you can find freebies, exclusive content, and subscribe to the show so you'll never miss an episode. If you found value in listening, I'd really appreciate a rating on iTunes. I can't tell you just how important this is. Or spread the love. Tell your friends, your fam, heck, tell your spirit animals. And follow me on Instagram at growthguide.love. Be sure to tune in next week for our newest episode.